Good afternoon, everybody. Today we are going to talk about photosynthesis. When we think about photosynthesis, photosynthesis is probably one of the most important processes on the planet. And that's because it's the source of all of the food that ends up eventually feeding the biosphere. So if you remember, all energy enters our system via light, and that light needs to be converted into chemical energy so that it can be utilized by other organisms. And photosynthesis is that process that converts solar energy into chemical energy. And when we think about photosynthesis, we tend to think about it as a terrestrial process. And a lot of photosynthesis does occur on land. But in fact, almost half of photosynthesis worldwide occurs in the ocean. So what you're looking at here is an image that is showing the chlorophyll content, both on land and in water. So you can get an idea of where the majority of photosynthesis is occurring. On land, the majority of photosynthesis is occurring where you have these darker blue and green areas, so like in the Amazon. When we think about the aquatic environment, where you see these greens and yellows, and in even some cases reds, that's where you have high amounts of chlorophyll content. It's generally around the continents where you have upwelling zones, so you have a lot of nutrient-rich areas. And so when we think about photosynthesis, this is a very important process. And when we think about who does photosynthesis, these are obviously our autotrophs, or our producers. Right? They're the ones that are able to convert an inorganic molecule like CO2 into an organic molecule. And because they're using the energy from the sun to strip off those electrons, we refer to them as being photoautotrophs, or autotrophs that use light. And when we think about who are our photoautotrophs, obviously, again, we have plants, but we also have a large number of our protists, both our multicellular macroalgae as well as our unicellular algae that go through photosynthesis in the oceans. We also have some prokaryotes that go through photosynthesis, such as our blue-green algae. A lot of people always ask about carnivorous plants because they're obviously eating other organisms. Does that make them a heterotroph? Well, our carnivorous plants, like this Venus flytrap that you see here, is green. And because it's green, we know that it still has chlorophyll. And so it's still able to go through photosynthesis. The reason that they eat other organisms is because most carnivorous plants live in environments that are generally very nutrient poor. And so for them to be able to get the mineral nutrients that they need to be able to grow and produce chlorophyll, they have to eat other organisms. So if you had a carnivorous plant like this Venus flytrap here, and you never fed it anything, it would still be able to survive because it makes its own food. It would just be very small. Or if you gave it fertilizer, it would be completely fine. So technically, this one is still a photoautotroph. But we do have some exceptions in the plant world, like this one right here. This one is called Indian pipe. This one is a parasite. In fact, it's a mycoparasite, which means that the roots of this plant tap into fungus and they steal the food that the fungus has started breaking down to consume itself. So it's basically stealing its food. You can tell it's not photoautotrophic because it isn't green, it's white, so it has no chlorophyll. And in fact, what you're looking at here are the flowers. The majority of this plant is underground. It never comes above ground, just the flowers for fertilization. Okay, so this plant is a heterotroph. Other organisms that do not go through photosynthesis are things like our animals, right, or our fungus. Both of these groups of organisms are strictly heterotrophic. They have to obtain the organic material from other organisms to be able to go through cellular respiration. So ultimately, they depend on photoautotrophs, not just for the food, but also for the oxygen that they produce. So does that mean that all animals can only get their nutrients from eating other animals or other organisms? Well, there is this cute little guy. This is a sea slug, and he is heterotrophic. So when he is young, what he does is he eats algae. But instead of breaking everything down and using it to produce energy, what he does is he steals the chloroplast from the algae and he lines his tissue with it. This process is called kleptoplasty because he's stealing the plastids, the chloroplasts. And so a number of studies have been done on these organisms that steal the chloroplast, and they found that in some cases they just store them and then break them down later when food is scarce. but some are actually able to utilize the chloroplast to be able to produce a carbon source. And the reason that they're able to do this is because they're small. And with all of these different little finger-like projections here, they actually have a huge amount of surface area. So they're able to absorb a lot of light. And that allows them to be able to get enough light energy to produce some food, but it's not enough to sustain them in times when there is no food for them to be around. So some animals can actually go through photosynthesis, but it's not a very common process. So if we think about photosynthesis, photosynthesis is probably the most important process on the planet. And the reason I say this is because it changed fundamentally how life on Earth exists. So if we think about life on Earth, our first form of life wasn't until about 3.8 billion years ago or so, and this is where our first prokaryotic organisms came around. These organisms were living in an environment that had high amounts of CO2 and methane, but not much oxygen in the atmosphere. We had very low amounts of oxygen. And so these organisms were undergoing anaerobic respiration or fermentation. And remember, these forms of cellular respiration produce lower amounts of energy. We have our first photosynthetic cells not long after our prokaryotic cells evolved, but it was not the same kind of photosynthesis that we have now. That didn't happen until much later. So you'll notice once we start getting water-splitting photosynthesis, right, where water is used as that electron donor and oxygen is produced as a byproduct, a number of really important things start happening. The first is that we start getting a large amount of accumulation of oxygen in the atmosphere. And once that happens, notice we start to get eukaryotic organisms. And at the same time, we start getting organisms utilizing aerobic respiration because now there's a different compound in the atmosphere that for many organisms probably was pretty toxic. But if you were able to utilize it to harness that energy, you were able to get larger. And not only were you able to get larger, notice once we start getting a large amount of oxygen in the atmosphere, we also get multicellularity because as you get larger and as you get multicellular, you require more energy. And because we had more oxygen in the atmosphere for more aerobic respiration, you could produce larger amounts of energy. The other thing that happened when we got large amounts of oxygen in the atmosphere was that we started to get the ozone layer. So not only did photosynthesis provide an opportunity for us to get larger and multicellular, but it also produced a compound that protects us from that UV radiation. So none of you would be here if it weren't for photosynthesis. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a better appreciation for this process and why it is so important and how it fundamentally changed life on this planet. So if we think about photosynthesis and where photosynthesis occurs, at the cellular level, it occurs in the chloroplast. And the chloroplasts are mainly found in the leaves. But that's not the only place where you can find chloroplasts. In fact, any portion of the plant that is green has chlorophyll, which means it has the potential to undergo photosynthesis. So if you think about some plants where they have their fruits, they're green before they ripen. Those are able to undergo photosynthesis. Many seeds before they ripen are green and are able to undergo photosynthesis. But for most plants, the main organ for photosynthesis is the leaf. And they have a very specific place within the leaf. So if we take a leaf and we do a cross-section, you'll see here's the upper epidermis and here's the lower epidermis. And all of the chloroplasts are found in the middle of the leaf. And the middle of the leaf is called the mesophyll. Meso meaning middle, phyll meaning leaf. And that's where they should be because they're protected from the outside environment. These are really important components of the machinery. The other thing I want to point out to you on this leaf are these openings right here. These are called stomata, or if we're looking at one, stoma for singular. They allow for exchange of gases between the leaf, the interior of the leaf, and the atmosphere. And inside each of these cells that contain those chloroplasts, you can find upwards to 30 to 40 chloroplasts per mesophyll cell. And if we remember our chloroplasts are a unique organelle. Them, along with the mitochondria, are part of that endosymbiosis theory of eukaryotic development. So if you remember, there's a couple of unique features that it has. The first is that it has a double membrane, both an inner and an outer membrane. Inside the inner membrane, we have these structures that look kind of like a stack of Thin Mints. Each one of those little discs is called a thylakoid. A collection of thylakoid is called a granum. The other region inside the inner membrane is called the stroma. Not to be confused with the stoma, that's the opening in the leaf, but the stroma is the region kind of like the cytoplasm of that organelle. The other thing I want to point out are these little dots here. Those are ribosomes, because remember, chloroplasts have their own ribosomes. The other thing that's not shown here is they also have their own circular DNA. So when we think about the chlorophyll molecule itself, the chlorophyll molecule is embedded within the membrane of the thylakoid. So here's that leaf. There's my mesophyll that has my chloroplasts. I look at an individual chloroplast. There are my thylakoids in a stack of a granum. And if I look at one and I look at the membrane, it's made up of the same component, just like your plasma membrane. So it's made up of phospholipids, which remember are mostly nonpolar. So if you look at the chlorophyll molecule, it's kind of like a lollipop. It's got a region right here, the head, which is polar. And we know it's polar because it's got all of these oxygen molecules and nitrogen molecules. This is the portion of the chlorophyll molecule that helps to absorb that light energy. And in fact, it's this magnesium molecule right smack dab in the center that's really important for absorbing it. The other portion, the tail right here, is mostly hydrocarbons. And so this allows it to be embedded in that hydrophobic portion of the thylakoid membrane with the structure, the ring structure, sticking out to absorb the light energy. So when we think about the overall process of photosynthesis, remember we need the light energy, we need carbon dioxide, and we need water. And we get those other components through other portions of the plant. So when we look at that underside of the leaf, remember we have those openings in the leaves that are called stomata. Stomata are flanked on two sides by structures called guard cells, and those guard cells open and close in relation to water pressure in the plant. So when they're open, carbon dioxide is able to enter. Some water comes in, but for the most part, water generally just leaves at the stomata. The other thing that leaves out the stomata is oxygen, which is important for the plant as well as for all of the organisms that rely on oxygen to go through cellular respiration. Okay, and we'll come back to this process again at the end. So if we think about the overall process of what is happening, the chloroplasts are basically splitting the water molecule. They're stripping off the hydrogen ions and the electrons associated with it, and they're being incorporated into a sugar molecule that is based off of that carbon dioxide backbone. As a byproduct, the oxygen that is left after the hydrogen is split off is released as a byproduct, a waste product of photosynthesis. So when we think about photosynthesis, just like cellular respiration, photosynthesis is a redox process. So the water is split, the hydrogens are stripped off, so water is oxidized to produce oxygen. On the other hand, the CO2 accepts the electrons and the associated hydrogens to become reduced form of sugar. And so if we think about the overall process of photosynthesis, it's basically a two-step process. The first part is the light reaction. This is where we harness that light energy and we put it into chemical stores such as ATP or electron carriers. And then the second half is the synthesis part. This is where we take that CO2 and the energy we just harnessed and convert that CO2 into a sugar compound.